The wind was a blade across the plains, thin and sharp, finding every gap in the threadbare cloak Alara clutched tight. It wasn't just the cold that bit. It was the emptiness stretching out under a sky the color of bruised lead. Days blurred into a single ache, a gnawing fear that sat heavy in her gut like a stone. She had run until her feet bled through her worn boots, guided by desperation and the vague promise of distance. But distance was a cruel illusion out here. Only the wind, the snow threatening to fall, and the vast, indifferent silence. She stumbled, knees giving way on the frozen ground. A whimper escaped her, caught instantly by the wind. Alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. The world was a closing fist, and she was caught in its grip. She pressed her face into the icy crust, the sharp cold a fleeting distraction from the deeper chill of despair that permeated her bones. There was no strength left, only the instinct to pull her limbs closer, a futile attempt to ward off the inevitable. Dying here, swallowed by the white, seemed less terrifying than the alternative, being found. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her, sharp and visceral. She pushed herself up onto trembling hands and knees, the vastness of the landscape mocking her fragility. Her eyes, raw from tears and the wind, scanned the horizon. Nothing, just the endless undulation of snow-dusted land, devoid of life, devoid of hope. Then a faint line against the gray, too straight for nature. Smoke? Her heart gave a violent lurch. Could be anyone, but the alternative was certain death. Every fiber of her being screamed caution, screaming retreat, but her body overruled, driven by a primal will to survive that whispered. Maybe. She forced herself forward, each step agony, each breath a shallow, painful gasp in the biting air. The line resolved into a low-slung cabin, hunkered against the elements like a permanent growth on the land. A single plume of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a gray finger pointing accusation ally at the indifferent sky. As she drew closer, her steps faltered. The cabin was small, rough-hewn, isolated. It felt less like a welcoming haven and more like a place that kept the world out, and perhaps kept things in. Fear warred with the desperate need for shelter. The snow began to fall, fat flakes swirling around her, obscuring the cabin, the world. She was committed now. Reaching the cabin door, she raised a trembling hand to knock, but hesitated. What sort of person lived out here, alone? What if they were worse than what she'd fled? The cold was a persuasive argument. Her knuckles scraped against the rough wood. Silence. She knocked again, louder this time, a frantic, ragged sound in the growing storm. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a man silhouetted against the dim light within. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed under the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, a formidable, silent presence. Alara could only see his eyes, dark and unreadable, watching her with an intensity that made her want to shrink away. She was a ghost in the storm, ragged, frozen, a creature of pure need. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a word of greeting. He simply stepped aside, a barely perceptible movement that was nonetheless an invitation. Alara stumbled past him into the cabin. The air inside was thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something gamey and wild. It was blessedly warm, a shock after the brutal cold, and the sudden heat made her head swim. She sank to her knees just inside the door, unable to stand any longer. The man closed the door, the sound final and heavy. He turned, and in the dim light from a single lantern, Alara could see him properly. His face was weathered, lined, his eyes deep-set and wary. A thick, dark beard covered the lower half of his face. He moved with a quiet economy, his presence filling the small space without seeming to take up too much room. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she'd come from or why she was there. He just watched her for a long moment, his gaze assessing, unblinking. Alara felt utterly exposed, stripped bare by the cold, the fear, and his silent scrutiny. She wanted to explain, to pour out her story, but the words caught in her throat, choked by years of silence and terror. He went to the hearth, stirred the fire, added another log. The flames licked higher, casting dancing shadows that seemed to lengthen the silence between them. He moved to a rough-hewn table, poured water from a kettle into a tin cup. He placed the cup near her on the floor. It was hot, and she wrapped her frozen hands around it, the warmth seeping slowly into her numb fingers. She drank greedily, the water scalding her tongue but bringing a measure of relief. He then retrieved a coarse blanket from a cot against the wall and dropped it near her. Again, no words, just the action. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, burying her face in its rough wool, breathing in its scent him, the cabin, the wilderness. It wasn't comfort, not truly, but it was protection from the immediate biting cold. Survival. That was all this was. He was not offering kindness, only shelter from the storm, perhaps because it was the practical thing to do. A man like this, living alone out here, wouldn't be given to unnecessary gestures. He returned to his chair by the fire, settling in with a quiet sigh, his rifle resting easily within reach. He stared into the flames, his back to her, his presence a solid, unyielding wall. Alara watched him, wary as a cornered animal. Every flinch, every tremor in her hands, every dart of her eyes was a testament to what she had endured. He didn't comment on it, didn't pry. He simply existed in the same space, allowing her to exist too without judgment, without expectation. It was a fragile truce, built on silence and necessity. But in this moment, in this small, warm cabin, away from the biting wind and the terror that pursued her, it felt like the greatest luxury in the world. She was Alara, running, hiding, but for now she was simply breathing. Days bled into weeks. The storm outside raged, then subsided, leaving the world blanketed in pristine, treacherous white. Inside the cabin, a quiet routine took hold. Quinn, she had learned his name from a worn book on a shelf, though he hadn't introduced himself, spent his days trapping, mending, doing whatever it was a man did to survive out here. Alara, her initial fear tempered by sheer exhaustion and the constant, non-threatening nature of his presence, found small ways to be useful. She swept the dirt floor, kept the fire going, washed the tin plates in melted snow. They rarely spoke. His dialogue was limited to curt observations about the weather or simple instructions. Wood, water. Snow's deep, her own voice, when she used it, sounded rusty and thin. But communication wasn't necessary. They communicated through shared silence, through the rhythm of their tasks, through the careful way he avoided looking directly at her for too long, and the way she learned to interpret his subtle shifts in posture, his quiet movements. He never asked about her past. He seemed to understand, without being told, that it was a place she could not revisit, a wound still too raw to expose. Her nightmares still came, vivid flashes of fear and pain that sometimes woke her with a gasp. But Quinn never stirred from his cot. He simply let the sounds of her fear dissipate into the quiet cabin air. Yet, his presence was a silent reassurance. She watched him, saw the calluses on his hands, the lines of effort around his eyes, the quiet strength in his frame. He was a man honed by the harshness of this land, resilient and self-sufficient. She began to see not just a potential threat or a reluctant savior, but simply, Quinn, a man surviving just as she was trying to survive. One evening, as she stirred a thin stew over the fire, her hand shook, slopping some of the liquid. A small, involuntary whimper escaped her. Quinn, who had been cleaning his rifle, paused. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time in days. His expression was unreadable, but something in his dark eyes seemed to soften, just a fraction. He didn't speak, but he placed the rifle carefully aside and walked over to the fire. He knelt beside her, taking the spoon from her trembling hand. Without a word, he stirred the stew himself, his movements slow and steady. His proximity was unusual and she tensed, bracing for. She didn't know what, but he did nothing, said nothing. He simply finished stirring, then handed the spoon back to her. His fingers brushed hers, and for a fleeting moment, his touch was gentle, unexpected. It was a small act, insignificant perhaps to him, but to Alara, it was a crack in the wall he held around himself, a glimpse of something beneath the stoic exterior. It was not pity, but something akin to understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of her struggle. In the days that followed, that small gesture stayed with her, a seed of tentative trust beginning to sprout in the frozen ground of her fear. The thaw came slowly, tentatively, but with it came movement. Not just the melting snow and the freeing of frozen streams, but the unsettling awareness that the paths that had been closed were now open. Alara felt it deep in her bones, a tightening dread she recognized instantly. The world outside, the world she had fled, was stirring. One afternoon, Quinn returned from his traps later than usual, his face grim. He didn't need to speak. The tension radiating from him was palpable. He checked the rifle by the door, his movements sharp, deliberate. Alara watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew. He knew. He finally looked at her, his gaze steady and direct. "Riders," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "Two of them. Headin' this way." He didn't ask if they were looking for her. He didn't need to. The color drained from Alara's face. Her past, the thing she had run from until she was broken, had caught up. It wasn't the faceless cruelty of the world anymore. It was specific, terrifying faces. They won't stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They don't give up." Quinn nodded, his jaw set. There was no surprise in his eyes, only grim acceptance. "They'll reach here by sundown." He didn't offer escape, not now. The snow was still too deep in places, the distance too great. They were cornered. He began to move around the cabin, securing the shutters, checking the small store of ammunition. Alara, her mind racing, forced herself to think. Running hadn't worked. Hiding was over. For weeks, Quinn had offered her silent sanctuary. Now, the threat was at his doorstep because of her. She couldn't hide behind his stoicism any longer. She had to face it alongside him. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice gaining a surprising steadiness. Quinn paused, looked at her. He saw not just the terrified girl who had stumbled into his life, but something else, a flicker of defiance in her eyes, a hardening of her resolve. "We wait," he said, "and we make 'em wish they hadn't come." He explained his plan, simple and brutal, suited to the isolation and the limited resources. Alara listened, absorbing every word. Her fear transmuted into a cold, sharp focus. She knew the men who were coming. She knew their cruelty, their arrogance, and she knew their weaknesses. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows, they heard the sound, the crunch of snow under hooves, drawing closer. Quinn took up his position near the door, rifle ready. Alara stood near the hearth, a heavy iron poker in her hand, her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, but her eyes were clear, watchful. The first rider dismounted outside, his voice rough, calling out. It was him, the one who had haunted her every step. Quinn didn't answer. The man called out again, louder, impatient. Then, the sound of the door being kicked violently inward. It splintered but held. Quinn fired. The shot echoed deafeningly in the small cabin. A cry of pain from outside. The second rider swore, scrambling for cover. Alara gripped the poker, her knuckles white. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing her ground. The silence that followed the shots was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the wind and a distant groan. Quinn reloaded his rifle, his movement sufficient. He waited, listening. Alara remained by the hearth, the iron poker still clutched in her hand, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She hadn't expected to feel. Not brave, perhaps, but certainly less terrified than she had anticipated. Seeing Quinn stand against them, his quiet strength turned into decisive action, had solidified something within her. She wasn't alone in this fight. After a long moment, Quinn spoke, his voice calm, almost conversational. "That's one," he paused, listening again. "Other ones pulled back. Won't come back here tonight. Not alone." He moved cautiously to the splintered door, peering out into the gathering gloom. "He'll tell the others. They'll be back." More of them, Alara nodded. She knew that too. This was not over, but they had bought time. More importantly, they had survived the initial confrontation. Quinn turned back to her, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was a new depth to his gaze, an acknowledgement of the shared danger, the silent partnership forged in the face of violence. He saw the fear still lingering in her eyes, but he also saw the resilience hardening her jaw, the resolve in her stance. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply said, "We'll be ready." In the days that followed, the cabin became a different kind of sanctuary. The tentative truce had evolved into a quiet understanding, a mutual respect born of shared peril. They worked together, strengthening the cabin, preparing for the inevitable return of those who sought to drag Alara back to the life she had escaped. Alara, no longer just hiding, actively participated. She helped reinforce the door, learned to handle the small pistol Quinn gave her, watched the surrounding land with a vigilance born of necessity. Her past was still a shadow, but it no longer defined her entirely. She was Alara, the woman who had run, yes, but also the woman who had endured, who had found refuge, and who was now prepared to fight for the quiet life she had stumbled upon. The transformation was subtle, internal, but profound. The haunted look in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination. The flinching stopped. She walked with a straighter back. Quinn watched her, saying little, but his approval was evident in the way he included her in his preparations. The way he sometimes met her gaze across the fire with a look that spoke volumes without a single word. They had both been solitary figures, weathered by the harshness of the world in different ways. Now they were two people standing together, their fates intertwined not by blood or romance, but by the simple, powerful act of one human choosing to protect another, and the protected choosing to stand and fight. The future was uncertain, still fraught with danger. The men would return. But as Alara looked out the window at the vast, snow-covered plains, no longer a symbol of her terrifying solitude, but a landscape they would defend together, a sense of quiet hope bloomed in her chest. She had found a place to stand, a partnership built on the solid rock of necessity and unspoken understanding. She was no longer running. She was building.